Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, Senior Editor at Forbes. AccuWeather is out with its 2025 Atlantic hurricane forecast. How bad will this hurricane season be? Joining us to discuss is Alex DaSilva. He is AccuWeather's lead hurricane forecaster. Alex, so good to have you back.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So you guys are out with your 2025 projections for hurricane season in the Atlantic Basin. Can you take us through just the broad overview? How bad will this hurricane season be?
Yeah, well, we're expecting 13 to 18 named storms. Last year we saw 18, so it looks like it's probably going to be a little bit less active than last year, at least in terms of the number of storms. The average is 14, so still expecting an average to above average hurricane season, expecting 7 to 10 of those storms to become hurricanes. Last year, we saw 11 hurricanes. And then of those 7 to 10 hurricanes, we expect 3 to 5 of them to become major hurricanes, and that would be category 3 or above. But the number that everybody really cares about here is how many of these are actually going to impact me. Well, we have 3 to 6 direct impacts on the United States here forecasted. Last year we saw 6 and the average is 4. So we still expect a very impactful hurricane season.
So just to break down that 13 to 18 number, are those storms that could potentially form in the Gulf or off the coast of the U.S. and maybe not even make landfall or not register in people's minds or even in the weather that we experience?
Yeah, correct. A lot of these storms won't even get close to land. Most of them curve out into the Atlantic. Maybe they impact Bermuda, or some of them even stay well east of Bermuda and then just work their way out and only affect shipping channels. So most of the storms actually never really get close to the United States. But it's those 3 to 6 that we're concerned about that could actually make landfall or get very, very close to the United States. And those are the ones that people need to watch very, very carefully.
Are you forecasting which months those might hit, those major storms making landfall, or is it too soon to say?
Well, hurricane season runs from June 1st all the way through the end of November. So we can really see storms any time in that period. But this year, especially, we're concerned that there could even be some early season development. The water temperatures are very, very warm in here. So everywhere where you see orange or yellow in here are indicating temperatures that are above average. So as we get a little bit closer towards the hurricane season, May storms are, fairly rare, but they do happen. And it wouldn't surprise me if we could get something to develop during the month of May, certainly during the month of June. So like I said, not very common to get something in May, but it does happen. And I think that because of the water temperatures being so warm and the fact that we're transitioning from a La Nina to neutral, you're still going to have a little bit of those La Nina impacts, lower wind shear across the basin. That makes things a little bit more conducive for early season or even preseason development.
So last year was a La Nina year. This year is, you said neutral, so not El Nina, not El Nino. Can you just explain a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, we're basically on the cusp of a La Nina, and essentially what that is the water temperatures way out across the eastern Pacific Ocean, right along the equator, would be cooler than average. And so they're cooler than average right now, but we're right on the cusp of a La Nina. Typically, we would need 3 straight months of that to officially be declared a La Nina. So I don't think they've quite done that, but nevertheless, the atmosphere is behaving like a La Nina. And as we go into the hurricane season, those water temperatures way, way, way down here are going to be warming up a little bit. However, there's a little bit of a lag time. And so, the Atlantic basin may actually act kind of like a La Nina during the months of May, June, and maybe even into July with some reduced wind shear across this area. But even during neutral years, which we expect most of this hurricane season to be in, the research has found that even though the numbers of storms might not be as high as they are during La Nina years, it's still very close. It's really those El Nino years that you really see a significant drop in tropical storms and hurricanes. Neutral years and La Nina years are actually very, very close.
And that would account for the forecast that you just shared being relatively close to the numbers that we saw last year. Let's get into the major storm impacts. What are the geographic areas you're forecasting could be at risk for landfall and significant damage?
Yeah, so when we're creating our forecast, we look back typically at years that we expect to have a similar atmospheric pattern. So we're looking back at years that probably started as a La Nina or a weak La Nina and then transitioned over to a neutral pattern during the hurricane season. And then we kind of look at, which areas were impacted during that time. And then we usually like to plot them. And this is what we have here. Every orange dot you see on this map was a tropical storm hit, and every red dot was a hurricane hit. And there were 12 years in what we call our analog package. And we circled the areas that we have kind of clustering, right? And so you can see a lot of clustering here along the Texas coast, some here in the north central Gulf Coast around the New Orleans area. And then you see some around the Big Bend of Florida and along the West Coast, some more over there near North Carolina, the North Carolina coast, and then some in Atlantic Canada as well. And so these are the areas that the past patterns have led to impacts in these areas. And so these are the areas that I'm concerned that if we indeed go towards neutral this season, which we expect it to do so, the atmospheric patterns support a greater than average risk in these circled areas here.
I'm looking at the North Carolina circle. North Carolina was battered towards the end of last year's hurricane season. Are you forecasting that the major storms will hit those exact same places that are still recovering from last year's effects?
I mean, they certainly could. And the thing about Helene, which was the one that brought all the rain to the Carolinas, was it actually made landfall down here in Florida. And it moved up. All the moisture moved up. And so that's really the concern, is that since we're expecting a lot of landfalls to occur down here, a lot of the impacts could come well inland here. If I go back to our tropical tracks from last year, you can see some of these storms, Beryl, Helene, they moved well inland and brought those impacts hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the coast. If you remember back to Beryl, there was a lot of tornadoes up here across portions of upstate New York. And then, of course, you had Helene, which brought the devastating flooding to the Appalachian Mountains. But again, those areas are well inland away from the coast. And so we want people, even if they live well inland away from the coast, to really pay attention to the forecast very carefully, because especially since we're expecting there to be impacts on the Gulf Coast, a lot of times after storms make landfall down here, where do they go? They go to the north and to the east, and they'll bring those impacts with them.
You raise a good point about the folks who live in these areas, and I'm wondering, it's the end of March. Hurricane season officially begins in June. What is your and AccuWeather's recommendation people do in those areas between now and June 1st, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you just want to have a plan in place, know what you're going to do. And again, a lot of people along the coast have hurricane plans, but it's the people inland that we're really concerned about, is that, you need to have a plan, especially if you live in mountainous terrain, things like that, in the Appalachians. Just know what you're going to do if a storm's coming down here and making landfall and could bring lots and lots of rain to your area. No. Are you going to evacuate? Are you going to move over here or over there? Just have a plan in place depending on where the storm is, what angle it's coming in at, and just know exactly, are you going to stay with friends and family? Are you going to go to a hotel? Just know where you're going to move to if a hurricane threatens your area.
Last year, there was enormous economic devastation from these storms. Can you remind us what AccuWeather's accounting of the full economic toll of the 2024 hurricane season was?
Yeah, these are the 2024 hurricane numbers in terms of the economic damage. And it's not just the physical damage. It is damage to tourism, to insurance premiums, things like that. So that's why AccuWeather's numbers are so big, because we factor in all of these other things. It's more than just the physical damage that you see with your naked eye. A lot of times these disasters can last years and years and years beyond that, the tourism loss, things like that. So Helene was number one, $225 to $250 billion in damage. And again, that's not just physical damage, that is total economic damage. Then you have Milton here in second place, spawned a lot of tornadoes in Florida, Milton did. And then as you go down the list here, Beryl, a lot of those tornadoes, again, well inland away from where the storm made landfall. And then you have several other storms here that still produced billions and billions of dollars in damage. So last year was an extremely destructive hurricane season, and we do expect multiple landfalls once again during the 2025 season.
So if I'm doing back of the envelope math, that's approaching almost $500 billion of economic damage. I'm rounding up a little bit. Is AccuWeather projecting that the economic damage of the 2025 hurricane season, will that come close?
It's hard to say, this far out because you can have storms that impact very populated areas or very not populated areas, right? Our forecast is for 3 to 6 impacts on the United States. We can kind of give an idea about what areas might be a little bit more vulnerable, but at the end of the day, it comes down to, are they big population centers, right? Because if it impacts a much larger population center like a Houston, a New Orleans, a Miami, right? A Tampa, those areas are much more populated. And if you get a storm to go in those areas, the damage and economic impact is likely going to be a lot higher than if the storm made landfall more in a swampy area. Of course, those impacts still travel well inland, but again, the landfall is also a very big piece of the puzzle here. So it's very difficult to put an exact number on the damage potential for this year. A lot of it does come down to exactly where the storms make landfall and then where they move after landfall as well.
Now, Alex, I know a lot of analysis and data goes into producing these forecasts, but since it is the end of March, I have to ask, what are the odds that your hurricane forecast could change? And what are the factors that could change that 3 to 5, those 3 to 6 figures that you were sharing with us earlier?
Yeah, and preparing the forecast, we look at all the different things, kind of what could potentially lead the forecast to be a little bit higher, a little bit lower. Right now, 18 is our top number for named storms here. I'd give it about a 20% chance that we actually exceed that number of 18. And I'll tell you why right now. If we look way out near Africa here, last year what we saw a lot of cooling down in this region here, way, way, way down there. So off the west coast of Africa along the equator. We call that an Atlantic Niña. Now that's completely opposite from what happens in the Pacific. It's a totally different, we call them teleconnections, but it has a very different impact. We talked about how La Niñas in the Pacific can actually lead to a more robust Atlantic tropical season. However, when you get cooler waters down in this region here, that can actually mess with the African easterly jet, the jet stream that transports tropical waves across Africa and then across the Atlantic, and it can also bring more dry air into the Atlantic. We saw that actually happen last year when this area cooled substantially during the middle of the season. Late August through the first 10 to 15 days of September were actually pretty quiet in the Atlantic, very little development. And I think a large part was because this area cooled. So that's something we're going to have to watch throughout the season. It's definitely possible that this area cools. If that occurs, we're probably on the lower end of the forecasted numbers. Now, here's the thing. If this area warms, if it significantly warms, that would be an Atlantic Niño. In that case, it actually increases tropical development across the Atlantic. So if that happens, that's the way we probably get to 18 or 19 storms, is if this area never cools, it stays warm throughout the season, and we see more activity because, the Atlantic basin, we know it's pretty much going to be warm throughout the entirety of the Atlantic basin. We have to look at these other factors to figure out how the season's going to go.
Alex, we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else our audience should know about AccuWeather's hurricane forecast for 2025?
Yeah, another thing we're going to be watching for. So we talked about the Atlantic Niña or Atlantic Niño, the thing right off of Africa, but let's switch back to the Pacific version, the one we started with. So let me go back to our graphic here, talking about a traditional La Niña, what it does to the Atlantic, more activity. That's the one in the Pacific, the big one. What we're expecting this season is that we're expecting most of the season to be in a neutral pattern. And like we talked about earlier, a neutral pattern and a La Niña typically are very close. That's what the research shows. Both of them have usually near to above average number of tropical storms and hurricanes. Now, late in the season, the question is, which way is it going to break? Is it going to stay neutral, or is it going to break back towards a La Niña, or maybe it goes the other way and goes up towards an El Nino? The reason why that's important is because that can influence the end of the tropical season. So we're talking end of October into November. If you remember last year, it was quite active at the end of the hurricane season, and that's because we were transitioning more into this La Niña pattern that we're currently in. So if at the end of the hurricane season, we're neutral and we start trending towards a La Niña, that could allow for a very active end to the tropical season, maybe several storms in the month of November. If things move the other way and it warms up in the Pacific and we get more of an El Nino pattern to develop, that could mean that we see more of a sharp cutoff to the end of the season. Maybe we don't see a whole lot at the end of October, and we maybe don't see a single storm during the month of November. Right now, if you ask me which way am I leaning right now, I think we're probably either going to be neutral or weak La Nina at the end of the hurricane season. And so that means that we could see an active beginning to the season, an active end to the season, and then maybe some lulls in the middle of the season if those waters in this area cool down here. So it could be very dynamic as we move throughout the hurricane season.
A dynamic hurricane season. Alex DaSilva, lead hurricane expert at AccuWeather. Thank you so much for joining us and taking us through this forecast. We really appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me.